So welcome back to the Midlands Evaluation Showcase, to those that joined for session 1, and welcome to those who have joined us for session 2. I'll briefly introduce myself. So I'm Michelle Hollier, Director of Research and Evaluation at Winning Moves. We're a largely Midlands-based research and evaluation consultancy, where I've been designing and delivering evaluations of government-funded policies, programmes, pilots for the last 20 years. So session 1 focused on evaluation of social, economic and other benefits of initiatives in the Midlands itself. If you missed it, it was recorded, and this session is going to be recorded as well for those that want to take another look after the event, or for those who weren't able to make it, we were able to share the recording. And this session is going to be focused on evaluating national and international policies and programmes from the Midlands. So we've got 2 presentations in this session, rather than the 3 that we had in session 1. So Professor Phil Dearden, who's going to kick us off, he's going to give us a slightly extended presentation. He is the head of Centre for International Development and Training at the University of Wolverhampton, and he is going to be presenting on the use of logical frameworks and theories of change in international development and lessons for local and regional evaluations. As with session 1, really welcome questions and comments after each presentation. Just pop them in the chat as they occur to you, or as you'd like to raise them after the presentation, or we'll open up for discussion if you prefer after each presentation as well. So I'll hand over to Phil now, and just shut my video down. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and thanks very much, Carl, and thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to share some experiences. And let me start by saying I'm not going to be talking about a particular evaluation. I'm going to be sort of reflecting almost on, I guess, 30 years worth of working with a few tools in international development work. But I've also been fortunate to work a little bit in the UK, and I want to sort of try and bring that in as well and see if there's any lessons that can be perhaps learned from international development work. Let me start with if I can. Let me start with a quick overview of where we're going. As I say, I want to talk about reflections rather than a particular example. I want to talk about project and program funding cycles and explain how they are critical, in my mind, to evaluation, and why they often mean it's too little too late. And that's not to put down evaluation as a topic. It's basically my experience of evaluation, of what evaluation really means. But then I want to talk about logical framework approach and the theories of change approach, and talk a little bit about their history and how they've arisen and what their value in international development work has been. And as we've already seen already from this morning with Nick and Mark's session, you know, people are using theories of change now across the UK, which is really interesting. Then I want to talk a little bit about what I call the differences between monitoring, reviews and evaluation. And a little bit about lesson learning as well. That's quite important with the logical framework approach, as I'll explain. And then I want to look at some lesson learning, the challenges that we have in international development. I think they're very similar from what I've heard this morning to UK work as well. But then to try and draw out 7 very simple sort of key lessons from what I want to say. As I've said, this is a session on reflections, and I want to reflect on my experiences. I've been very fortunate in my career to be involved in delivery of a large number of very large international development programs. I've had the pleasure of working in Nepal, Brazil, a number of other countries. And over my career, I've sort of reflected on sort of evaluation work. I've done a number of evaluation studies. I don't do that many evaluation studies because I find I lose friends if I do evaluation studies. I'd much rather actually be involved in delivering work, delivering projects rather than evaluating it. but I have done a number of evaluation studies, including some very complex international, global international development studies. One being on climate change, looking at UK spend on climate change, another one looking at training with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and another one looking at enterprise development with the International Labour Organization. But from all this work, I've really sort of thought through what I've been doing and how I've been doing it. And looking at the similarities of the planning processes involved, similarities of projects, programs, of sector plans, and even of country plans. And I've been very fortunate in recent years to do a lot of country plans with the International Labour Organization. And the processes involved in this, in my mind, are very similar. And we've developed what we call a series of thinking tools, which really enable participatory, inclusive, and results-based approaches to the design, which I think is critical when it comes to evaluation. More on that in a minute. And we've tried to turn some of our very practical, not academic, very practical experience into a series of training courses that we run from my center, a series of training courses really looking at these two particular approaches, the logical framework approach and the theory of change approach. And we've devised a couple of online training programs, results-based, management-based training programs. And you can access those here if you're interested in looking at those. So we've tried to pull together a lot of sort of our international development work. Just very quickly, back in the late 90s, I was involved a lot in the Health Action Zone work in the UK, poverty-focused work, I think it's probably best phrased as in the UK, where we were involved in doing a lot of training across the UK in logical frameworks and then theories of change. And that was a really exciting time, as many of you older members will remember. New Labour came in and a lot of poverty sort of focused work in UK. For me, it was very exciting. This has made me really reflect, or working in evaluation has really made me reflect on why do we evaluate things. And this, for many of you on this call, will be very simple. But for me, it's actually really important. We can look backwards, we can look back to the past, and we can talk about accountability, and we can talk about showing impact. But in my experience, having worked in international development work, it's often too little, too late. And that's rather sad. I think that's a real restriction on evaluation. I would much rather be looking forward to what I call lesson learning, where we really look forward, improving the quality and improving policies. And that's the sort of focus which I think evaluation really needs to have if we're going to be serious about it. But there are two things which are really key, in my experience, in international development terms, which really limit that. The first is the design. Design is absolutely key, and I've been fortunate in learning some of the lessons from my experience and having been involved in design of a number of programs and projects, but also funding cycles. And we've heard this already this morning. Funding cycles are a real limitation to the work that we are doing. And if you look at international development funding, we have a sort of funding cycle where we have the idea of some sort of a project or program idea, then a sort of concept note, then a design approval process where we design a project, then we get it going, we get it implemented, and we might complete it, and then we might do a bit of internal or external evaluation. And evaluation comes in at the later stages of the project cycle, often too late. In the middle of all this is what I call a series of thinking tools. Tools many of you will be very familiar with: stakeholder analysis, problem analysis, risk analysis. I'm not going to be talking about those today. I'm talking about results or logical frameworks and the theory of change. And the point I want to make is that there are a whole variety of tools, and I'm just going to focus on those two today. And I also want to bring in the fact that lesson learning, as opposed to evaluation in international development work, is critical. And that, for me, should be the real focus of what we are doing. I've talked about processes. When I look at planning, whether it's at project level, program level, country level, I see planning as a series of key questions on a journey from here to there. And when we're teaching project design, we take people through these very, very simple questions. Huge amounts of volumes and volumes on project planning and international development. But if you distill it all down, you come to what I think, seven key questions. Who are we? So who are the stakeholders? Where are we now? What are the problems, possibilities? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? What is it we're wanting to do in terms of results? What's going to stop us getting there? So risk assessment. And the key one for us as evaluators here today is, how will we know if we've got there? How do we prove it? How do we monitor, review, and evaluate? Or put another way, how do we know we're on track? Or how do we know we've been successful in what we're doing? It's as simple as that. It's not sort of rocket science by any stretch of the imagination. And when we address these questions, many people use, in international development work, use a results framework, or what's known as a log frame. And you can see a mini one there where you have objectives, indicators, data sources, and assumptions. And you have down the left-hand side, impact, outcome, outputs, and activities. And this has been the logical framework tool. Many of you will be very familiar with it. This is a very old slide. As you can see, it goes back to 2003 when I wrote this stuff up. And we really look at the benefits of log frames. Log frames help summarize massive amounts of documentation into a few pages. Secondly, they can be very useful in terms of participation, ownership, and commitment if they're used the right way, in a participatory way, where people develop the contents of the log frame in a process way. Thirdly, they're a great tool for providing a logical sequence of questions, 16 questions for the 16 boxes, essentially. So they're a common process and a format. And that helps us, if we have the right stakeholders involved in the design, to sing the same tune, we have coherence, and we can communicate with each other. We have a language. We know what an outcome is, we know what an output is, we know what an activity is, we know what impact is, although we've talked a little bit about that this morning in slightly different approaches. They're also very useful because they force us to do a risk assessment and force us to make clear the assumptions that we are making, and those have to be stated very clearly. Inevitably, they are a monitoring, review, and evaluation framework, which are helpful for assessing performance. And then finally, this very cryptic little picture over here. They should, if used correctly, and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, they should be what's called a living process document. So it's a document that's alive. It's not a document that is stuck on a shelf or stuck in a cupboard and not used. It's a living document that should be used by the project manager almost on a daily basis. We should be checking it. And those are some of the benefits of using log frames. And as I say, they've been well written up over many, many years. There are also a number of disadvantages to them, serious limitations. And way back in, I think, the late 90s, Gasper basically came up with three critiques of them. Logicless frames, they don't always have all the information in them, they're a lacking frame, they're just a summary. And thirdly, related to that last point, sometimes they get locked, and some donor agencies, some development banks have locked people into what they are delivering and not use them as a living process document. And when you get this, I'm not going to show the video here, but there's a video on YouTube which is a little bit about me talking about how people have tried to update log frames recently and some of the new bits of log frames. They are based on what we've been talking about already this morning, which is called we call the results chain in international development. And that is really where we have the implementation of the project leading to results. And this is really the core of what's called results-based management. So we have inputs going in, and we have activities, things we're doing. That gives us outputs, the end products, the services, the deliverables, and they should be within the team of people delivering, and if you like, the terms of reference of what's being delivered. That leads to outcomes, and that's what we want to see. And that leads, hopefully, or contributes to long-term development improvements to which we contribute. And that's what we call impact in international development terms. And of course, this results chain is all based upon three things: causality, attribution, and contribution. And those are quite important sort of to recognize. It's based on those three. The first one is absolutely critical. The results chain is based upon causality. And many of you will know this. We basically say, if we do these activities, we deliver the outputs, and if we deliver the outputs, we attain the outcome, and if we have the outcome or outcomes, that helps us to contribute to the impact. And if you simplify that, you're really talking about the how, the what, the why, and the ultimate why. And different donor agencies use different language here. Some people talk about impact as goal, some people talk about outcomes as specific objectives. But the language that's being used now by most people, and sadly not all, but most people, is activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And it's been really interesting being involved in research to actually see that this thinking, which developed really in international development sort of phrasing, is now finally finding its way into things like the Research Excellence Framework. Everyone's talking about impact, and impact is becoming the big thing. And Reed and Ferrier and other co-authors have just written this up, where they talk about evaluating impact from research in a very interesting sort of way, where they really draw on this results chain in a rather fascinating way, or at least for me. And there are several other authors recently who have looked at sort of work, looked at this sort of results chain. Of course, it is a results chain, and you can see the logic. That's the logic that's called, that's where the logical framework gets its name from. But it's based upon the world as seen as our planning processes. If you like, a set of dominoes where we put one domino and they all fall over, or one of these cradle toys. But of course, that's not the real world that we live in. That isn't actually how the world works. And of course, this really, and just to illustrate this, I've had the pleasure of working in Afghanistan, and this is the sort of stuff we were working in Afghanistan. It's a lot more complex than a set of dominoes just falling over. It really is a lot more complex than perhaps we think it is. And it was this sort of thinking which really led to the theory of change being developed back in the late 90s. And the theory of change was really developed by Aspen Institute Roundtable back in '95. They developed it, and they used it for the evaluation of what they called comprehensive community initiatives, CCIs as they were called at the time. And they were based upon the fact that the world isn't as simple as a causality sort of domino effect. And it really it was developed in international terms to really overcome the fact that log frames or logical frameworks had really become a bureaucratic tool, a sort of fill in the boxes type tool. So the theories of change became quite popular. What are they all about? They're all about the same. They're all about a hypothesis of how change will happen. They're a process, a design process, as well as a product. But the interesting thing about a theory of change is that there's no standard format. Unlike a logical framework that has a series of boxes we fill in, there's no standard format. And as Patricia Rogers said back in 2014, we're looking at beliefs, assumptions, and hypotheses around how change happens. That's what we're trying to put down when we develop a theory of change. Of course, and there's a reference there, but of course, often we don't spell things out. We do our activities, we get our outputs, we think we're going to have an impact, but maybe the outcome isn't there. Maybe we don't spell things out clearly enough in our project design. And this really led to the fact that, as I say, theories of change were developed. This was the first theory of change I ever worked with. This was in the health action zones back in the heydays of the 1990s, just after New Labour came in. And a whole series of poverty-focused programs were rolled out across the country. And this was the first theory of change I saw. A little bit more complicated than a log frame, as you can see, but fairly simple. You can see the logic involved there. Here's another one. This is around provision of after-school homework programs. You can see what we're trying to do, what the strategic goal is. Fairly simple sort of theories of change that were developed. In international development work, they've become a lot more complicated, a lot more complex. This was one I came across when I was looking at the midterm evaluation of the UK's International Climate Fund back in 2014. You can see it's very carefully color-coded, it's quite neat. It's got 12 key performance indicators in it, and you can see it's capturing the private sector interventions, governance interventions, and civil society interventions. So it's capturing the complexity, if you like, of what we're trying to do. Here's another one that I was heavily involved in. This one looks a little bit more like a logical framework. This was a big climate change program I was involved with in Rwanda for a number of years. And you can see the inputs, the outputs, the outcome, and the impact, but a series of assumptions put forward in this one, and then some mechanisms put in place. And here's another one. This was around some of the youth development work I was involved with. Very simple, not particularly helpful. And when it came to evaluating it, possibly worse than useless. The point really around the theory of change is that there is no format to it. That's one of its advantages, but it's also one of its disadvantages, in my opinion. Here's our Centre for International Development and Training theory of change. We had great fun putting this together during the pandemic, interestingly, where we've got inputs, outputs, outcomes, and the impact. And you can see that the impact that we want to have is really contributing to the international development goals, the sustainable development goals. And we're very open about this. We're very happy to share what we're doing. You can see our assumptions, and you can see the enabling factors. One of the interesting things is that you can present this in different ways. You can present it that way, if you like, across the page or up the page. The nice thing about it is that there's no one format, so you can use different formats for different purposes. One of the things about theories of change, like logical frameworks, in my opinion, is that they need to be participatory tools. And this really has led to some of our staff being involved in running a whole series of practical workshops. And there are a number of challenges that you will face when you have these workshops. Some people are really afraid of diagrams. They really don't like them. Some people are very uncertain around what's really needed and what's good practice. Some people just can't take time out to reflect on what they're doing. They might be very worried about how complex things are, and they want to keep the box shut and safe, if you like. They might be trying to retrofit the theory of change after the project has been written. And I've had the pleasure of trying to do this on several occasions, very difficult, and also of duplicating the logical framework if there is one. And of course, this might lead to some hostility. Many of you have probably seen this cartoon before, but it's not everybody likes logic, not everybody likes theories of change, and they can be quite threatening. I now want to move on a little bit to say a little bit about monitoring, review, and evaluation. And in international development work, framing the assessment of performance has been very, very important. Many of you will be familiar with the Rainbow framework and the sections in there which help us define and frame what to be is evaluated. And many people talk about monitoring and evaluation. Well, in international development terms, we talk about monitoring, review, and evaluation. And this is quite important and really relates to the logical framework. And I want to quickly try and show you how it sort of fits together. Monitoring is something which you do, you're really looking at the activities. Are the activities leading to the outputs in the logical framework? There are two middle columns there. And this is something you, as a project manager, you should be doing regularly, tracking, but you're really assessing the activities and the outputs, the progress and the processes. And it can lead to changes. If things aren't working, change it. Review is usually where you might stop at the end of a year, perhaps an annual review. Most international development projects now have to do this. They're forced to have an annual review. And here we're looking at the outputs and the outcome. Are the outputs beginning to deliver the outcomes? Are we achieving the outcomes? And quite often this is done with an internal team, but sometimes it's also, I've often been asked to go in and help facilitate this process. And again, it can lead to changes in policy. If you're halfway through a program, halfway through a 3-year or 5-year program, you don't just carry on doing things if they're not working, you change things. But in international development work, this gives evaluation a slightly different meaning, in the sense that it really, in logical framework terms, it really means we're looking at the assessment of outcomes and impact. And this is usually done sometimes midterm, usually at the end, or usually after the program. And as we've heard already today, this sometimes requires scientific rigor, often looking at a theme or an intervention, usually done externally, and can lead to major changes in policy, strategy, or future work. So very, very important, but it's slightly different level from monitoring and sort of reviewing work. And it does have a very specific meaning in itself. Does the theory of change offer us things when it comes to evaluation? Yes, it does. It can do. If you have a good theory of change, it can be very helpful. It can help you identify the key evaluation questions. How do we get from X to Y, for example? Did the intervention actually work? And did any assumptions hold? Did it actually support any deeper understanding? We spent a lot of time developing a theory of change, but why? What does it help us think through? And does it help us if we failed? Is it because of poor theory or possibly because of poor implementation? And there's a big difference between the two there. And it also perhaps helps support impact claims. We can actually track variables and credibly link outputs to program outcomes and hopefully up to contribution to impact. So the theory of change is also very valuable when it comes to evaluation work. So putting the two together, and those of you who are up to date with the literature will know that there's a bit of debate going on around which is the best. You know, are log frames better than theories of change? Many people are trying to improve log frames. There's a continuous updating of logical frameworks. Hamdi has recently tried to update it. DFID have tried to update theirs with different methodologies. There's a big debate going on around these tools, as I'm sure some of you will be aware. But the results or the log frame is useful in my experience when it comes to monitoring, review, and evaluation, and I hope I've shown you that. But theories of change are also appropriate. And in my mind, it's not one or the other. And academics who start arguing that theories of change need to replace log frames, in my mind, are really out of place. We need to use both together. And I'm really pleased to read last year that Ringholder and Kohlberg said exactly the same. The combined usage of these two tools is very helpful if it's held lightly and approached from a learning and not a compliance perspective. So if it's taken as a learning approach, then it can be very, very useful. I want to finish by saying that lesson learning in international development is the biggest challenge of all. Donors, development banks are under real pressure to spend. There's often a loss of institutional memory, lots of staff moving from one thing to another. Often we're working in insecure places, Afghanistan, for example. And the pace of change is such that it's very, very difficult sometimes to really get down to evaluation. There is an unequal nature of power in development relationships in international development, and that's also quite important. Sometimes there's real focus, a real myopic sort of tunnel vision that donors have, and that really gets in the way of what we're trying to do. But there's much more of an organizational culture, a lack of reflection, a lack of space and time really to reflect on what it is we're doing. And related to that, a lack of any real incentives to learn. And that's perhaps the biggest disadvantage, biggest challenge, I think, in international development work. So 7 quick key lessons that I've tried to draw together. The first one, why are you doing the evaluation? Why evaluate in the first place? Are you really sure you want to be spending your life evaluating things? Be fully aware of the limitations. We've heard that already today. The funding cycles on evaluation. I think the logical framework and theory of change approaches both have a lot to offer. I think they are useful, and they are useful at project, program, sector, or country level, if you're working at those sorts of levels. They're best facilitated through a process, a participatory workshop process, in my experience. And that means you need to have an awareness of the strengths and the weaknesses of these tools. It is absolutely essential. And combining them, I think, is combining the, hopefully you can combine the best of the two. Personally, in international development work, I think it's critically important to define and frame any evaluation work. And I've read many evaluation studies that don't really do this, but it is really, really important in my mind that we know whether we're talking about reviewing or whether we're talking evaluating, or perhaps whether we're talking about lesson learning. And I've been pleased to be involved in a number of sort of lesson learning meta, if you like, meta studies. And then finally, personal point, before undertaking any evaluation work, really question how your findings are actually going to be used. Don't spend weeks or months of your life really undertaking evaluation work that isn't going to be used. And sadly, in international development work, a lot of it isn't actually used, in my experience. Thank you all very much for your time. I hope I've kept to time. Let me stop sharing and hand back.
Thanks, Phil. You have definitely kept to time. I've just started doing theories of change in the international development space. I kind of wish I'd had this presentation before I'd started, because the discipline is quite different from as learned in the kind of UK government context, and this would have been better than learning on the job. So are there any questions for Phil? We have a few minutes for questions. Either raise them through the chat, or if people want to put their hand up or shout out, that is fine. I'll ask one while we're waiting. I think you talked there about, so a couple of the evaluations that I'm currently involved in, we're part of the MERL team, so we're doing monitoring, evaluation, review and learning. It feels like the skill set of the evaluator is different for each one. You call for more of the lessons learned type approach. Do you that feels quite a hard skill set? Is there any reflections on that, or any thoughts about the kind of skills you need for that lessons learned piece?
Yeah, I think there's several approaches to that. Thanks for the question, Michelle. Several approaches to it. One, I've been fortunate, being invited in to do some lesson learning work, some climate change work, and also some work with the United Nations Industrial Organization. And I think there's two ways of doing it. One is doing a huge amount of reading, where you go through, maybe the last 5 years of evaluation reports, and you try and pull out the lessons. But I think there's a distinction between lessons learned and lessons to be learned. And that's one thing I would really distinguish between, because quite often a project might have learned a lesson, and that might be well documented, but it then needs to be learned by others. And that sharing is really, really critical. And that's the bit that often doesn't happen. And that's what doesn't happen with evaluation studies. Evaluation studies are done and they're stuck on the shelf in many cases in international development work. That's not to say they are in UK. I think there's less of that in the UK context, but in international development work, that tends to be the pattern, I'm afraid to say. The other approach, apart from doing a massive amount of reading and sort of documenting stuff that comes out of sort of evaluation reports, is to workshop it. And I've had the pleasure of facilitating sort of a few workshops where you bring in a whole variety of people who've been involved in those studies, and you basically workshop it. You workshop it and you write shop it. And you say, let's see what we've learned, and let's see what we need to learn with others not in the room. And that approach, I think, has been really interesting, really a really interesting approach to follow, because lesson learning is done by individuals. We all talk about organizations learning organizations. Learning organizations are a bit like the Loch Ness Monster. We want to think about it, we want it to be there, but it doesn't exist. In my experience, organizations don't easily learn. It's individual people who learn, and it's individual people that matter when it comes to this work.
Yeah, and hopefully they don't move on to another job.
Usually they do.
Yes, quite. Any other questions for Phil?
Hi, Michelle. It's Hamayin. So I'll got to turn my camera on as well. Hi.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, Phil. Thank you for that. It was very useful for everyone. Hamayin Sultan, spent a good period of time in international development myself, international NGO. Now I'm a consultant. The discussion around log frames and theories of change was very, very useful. Thank you for that. My question is, and I suppose it links into the issues of learning organization, that is it really possible to require, is it even possible to allow people to learn? Because when you institutionalize log frames, theories of change, when you require that they be included in project proposals, they become a tick box exercise. And especially when you're sort of saying, okay, this proposal needs to be ready in a week, then it's just a tick box. Okay, that, done. They'll send it. And it ends up on my desk, for example, when I'm trying to plan an evaluation, and there's almost nothing there. And the genesis of that goes back to when the project was designed. And yeah, it was essentially not enough time. So that's the issue there as well. I think that how can this actually be done properly within the pressures, which you also mentioned about from funders? So that's things that need to be done, how they're done, how's the speed?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really, really pertinent question, really good question. And it gets to the heart of the criticisms of log frames. Actually gets to the criticism of theories of change as well, interestingly. Either of them can become tick box tools. And that's what we need to avoid. It really is, as you say, around design. And that design bit is absolutely critical. And my answer to this is really around, and I remember working in Sheffield, using log frames in Sheffield in the Health Action Zone days, is if you're designing a project, maybe involving thousands of pounds, quite often in international development work, millions of pounds, you really need to spend some time thinking through what you're doing at the design stage. And quite often people are in such a hurry, they just don't do that. And the best way of using either of these tools is frankly, through a workshop process. Bring a group of people involved together, workshop it, and really come up with what you're trying to do. And I've had the pleasure of doing that on many, many occasions, even at country level. The International Labour Organization, who I've been doing a lot of work with, are now doing that at country level, which is a fantastic way of working. Bring together the key stakeholders for a couple of days, maybe just a day, get them in a room, work through this process, stick it up on the wall, and get agreement on it. Because you can't use these tools you can use them as a tick box exercise. If you use them as a tick box exercise, it's a disaster, as you rightly point out. So it is around design, it is around really overcoming the challenges of the funding cycle and actually saying, look, we need to spend a bit of money, we need to spend a bit of time designing our project slightly better, rather than asking a donor to invest a huge amount of money in something that really isn't very robust.
Thanks, Phil.